I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is Under the Dome.
From the bottom of my heart, thank you, Alberta, and may our province remain forever strong and free. Thank you. Thanks,
Danielle Smith and the UCP have been sent back to the legislature with another majority government, but it wasn't as resounding a victory as Jason Kenney won in 2019. The UCP lost a number of key seats, and the NDP swept the table in Edmonton. What does this all mean for Danielle Smith going forward? And what is Rachel Notley's future, considering she and the NDP failed to knock off the UCP in Monday night's election? All that and more on Under the Dome. My guests today, Edmonton Journal columnist David Staples and Edmonton Sun columnist Lorne Gunter. There's a lot to talk about, so we're going to dive right in. As we watched the election results roll in, and it was clear that the UCP were going to win and win with a majority, a pretty comfortable majority. One thing I was reminded of was this quote that Danielle Smith had earlier in the campaign or late last year. I can't remember specifically when, but the notion that the UCP could afford to lose even half their seats in Calgary and still win the election. And that's kind of what we saw happen on Monday night. The UCP lost a number of key seats in Calgary. They lost some key seats in the Edmonton area as well, but still walked away with a majority government and a fairly comfortable majority. David, as we watched the results roll in on Monday night, what were you thinking? What are your general thoughts on how the election night went for the UCP?
Well, first of all, it was that kind of free talk, loose lips sink ships that got Danielle Smith in a lot of trouble on a lot of issues. And she gradually, eventually learned sometime, I think it was her New Year's resolution is no more bozo eruptions. She gradually learned not to say stupid things like that. And so it turned out that her prophecy became very, very close to the truth. Trevor Toome, the UFC economist, did a little study today, and he said as few as 1,500 votes in Calgary, if they had gone the other direction, we'd have an NDP majority today. So it was extremely close. It seems to have matched up with what the pollsters were saying in terms of popular vote, in terms of Calgary being the key battleground. You know, I didn't make a prediction myself. I was just kind of going with what the pollsters were saying, and I was thinking, you know, if you go by two things, elections are decided by who has the best fear campaign. And I thought the NDP actually did a really good job in raising fears and doubts about Danielle Smith. They really went after her hard. And a lot of it had weight to it. It wasn't just nonsense fear. It was things she had said that were offensive to many people and had them concerned. But the other thing that decides elections is follow the money. And I think in the end, most Albertans thought about their economic situation, their own pocketbook, and they thought, I'm going to be better off paying less taxes. Be good to get rid of that carbon tax. I'm worried about my power bill going through the roof. I'm voting UCP. So I was thinking the UCP was going to win, like the poll said, and that's what turned out.
Now, Lorne, you yourself made a prediction. You figured there'd be maybe a 10 to 15 seat victory for the UCP. I think we're kind of in that window. I know there's a couple of close ridings that will go to a recount. And we could see them switch. What did you make of Monday night's win for the UCP?
It's pretty much what I thought it was going to be, and that was hold your nose and vote UCP for your economic interests. And that's kind of what David was saying, is that, you know, there were an awful lot of people who were not very keen to vote for Danielle Smith. And if you look at it, in Edmonton and Calgary together, there are 46 seats. Only 12 went to the UCP. And Smith has lost a lot of very senior cabinet ministers. And I think that's down to her. And that's down to the fact that there was simply an awful lot of urban, suburban voters who didn't see themselves in her. And increasingly now in politics, people want to know that their leaders understand who they are, where they live, what their motivations are, what their priorities are. And she didn't give off that vibe. And she did, until about February, give off this kind of icky vibe for urban and suburbanites, which is I want to refight the pandemic. I want to associate with people who are on the fringes of civil rights issues on the right, not civil rights. I mean, there's a lot of flaky civil rights people on the left who the NDP get away with associating with. You don't get away with it if you associate with the flakes on the right. And yet Smith decided she wanted to do that. So she was their own worst enemy. And as a result of that, the NDP have made a bit of a breakthrough in Calgary. The other side of that, though, is that Notley played it very well in two ways. One, as David said, on the fear side, the NDP's war room was superb at dealing with Smith. They didn't go at really over the top. They simply said, look, this is what this woman said. And if you think that that's mainstream Alberta, then okay, fine. But we don't think it's mainstream Alberta. We don't think you think it is. And they were right about that. There were an awful lot of mainstream urban and suburban voters who were very uncomfortable with Smith. That was number one. The NDP did very well. And they were pretty good at portraying Notley as the defender of mainstream Alberta values. She wasn't. She wasn't even close. But that was their shtick. She was in favor of turning over public construction to unionized construction companies. She was in favor of a big tax increase. And I actually think that's what did the NDP in. It reminded people in enough ridings in Calgary of how bad the NDP had been for the economy from 2015 to 2019. And that was what pushed them. It stopped their forward momentum. There was forward momentum till the 16th of May. Then they dropped their tax platform, and that momentum stopped.
Now, you both have mentioned that the NDP doing a good job on fear and smear and kind of really hampering their campaign when it came to the economy. But I'm also wondering whether they overplayed the fear card. This idea that, they kept saying that Danielle Smith is going to make you pay for a family doctor. And I understand that there was video of her out there in the past asking the question, perhaps rhetorically, wondering whether a family doctor visit should be covered by healthcare or whether people should pay for it with a health spending account or whatever. But the fact that Danielle Smith didn't make that a part of her campaign, was actively campaigning against that narrative, if the NDP maybe overplayed that hand and perhaps, cried wolf a little bit, that people weren't buying it after a certain point. Did that factor into it for either of you?
I didn't see their supporters not buying that completely, though. Like, it really was working people up. I think it was very effective. And I don't say like that the fear and smear, I don't use that in a negative sense. I think that's politics. And they did a hell of a job. I think their real weakness, Dave, was their policy book. The world has changed and the NDP hasn't. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, energy security is foremost in the world. It's changed Europe, transformed Europe. But the NDP's energy policy, when you look at it, and I really mean this, it is one of the most radical energy policies in the entire Western world. I mean, they favor a carbon tax, which has been rejected by the Biden Democrats. They're against nuclear power, or lukewarm on it at best, when the whole world, except for the Greens in Germany, has started to embrace nuclear power. They're lukewarm on LNG. Germany even is crazy for LNG. So then they have they're in favor of a higher carbon tax. They're in favor of corporate tax raises, as Lorne pointed out. So this whole host of policies economically don't make sense for a province like Alberta, which is all in on energy abundance, which is actually a winning idea right now. People understand that cheap energy drives cheap prices, affordability, good jobs, cheaper products, in a way that wasn't really sinking in for a long time with people. So I think because their policy playbook was so weak, they really needed to rely on that. They didn't have anything to go back to, because the second they start talking about the economy, they're in trouble. And it turns out the second they start talking about a number of other policies, they're in trouble, such as crime, such as drug addiction, where finally the UCP, instead of like hammering down on drug addicts, like you drug addicts, you bad people, which is what conservatives have always done, they said, we're going to have a helping hand for you guys on the streets. We're going to give you free treatment. Something the NDP didn't even offer at the time. So Smith counteracted some of the negativity about her, enough of the negativity about her, by I think embracing what I would call compassionate conservatism in a big way in the last few months. And the entire UC policy direction has been heading in that direction for some time as well. They have finally found an answer for the modern spirit. And it's this kind of old style the initial George Bush, 1,000 points of light or whatever that was, view of the world, where conservatives lend a helping hand to other people, as well as everything else they do.
Hey, Lorne, from your end perspective, do you feel that, for people who were looking at the NDP or who were voting in the NDP, I know a lot of their base were probably voting NDP because of the policies they were laying out, but do you feel like there were a lot of people voting NDP simply because Rachel Notley is not Danielle Smith?
Yes, absolutely. And also on the positive side, because Rachel Notley is Rachel Notley. She is very trustworthy. I don't like her. I think that lots of times her ads and a lot of her speeches and things I just got a bad vibe out of them. They were sort of contrived, but that is the only thing they've got. If you start fighting based on policy platforms, they lose. If you start fighting based on economic records, they lose. Where do they win? They win by portraying Danielle Smith as unfit to be the leader of a broad spectrum province. And they win based on the fact that Rachel Notley is well liked by a lot of people. Now, some of the things that they were doing, like David was talking about with, you'll have to pay to see a family doctor if you let the UCP in. I do think they overplayed that. But it did keep their base very excited. And if you watch the communications among New Democrats online, it really motivated them. But I have never seen a political base more loyal and more enthusiastic than Alberta New Democrats. I mean anywhere. American Democrats, American Reagan Republicans, federal liberals, nobody is as loyal to their leader and their party as Alberta New Democrats. They love Rachel Notley. They are over 92% committed from one election to the next to vote for their party. So why you would need to whip up your base by continuing all of this scaremongering, I don't understand, because they were doing all this scaremongering themselves online. And besides, they're already as enthusiastic as any voter base I've ever seen. What they did, though, was they did not convince an awful lot of former UCP voters to switch to them. They convinced Alberta Party voters, they convinced Alberta Liberals, they convinced all of those also ran parties on the left to come to them. They brought up their vote total by about 150,000. I've got to take a look again this morning at the more complete numbers, but about 150,000, most of which they picked up from other parties on the left or left of center. Fascinating to me, this is almost completely aside. The Alberta Liberal Party got a lower percentage of the popular vote on Monday than the Solidarity Movement led by Artur Pawlowski, the crazy street preacher who Danielle Smith got in so much trouble with. The Solidarity Movement actually got more votes than the Alberta Liberal Party. That's how much the NDP sucked out of the other left of center parties. And it was nearly enough, but it wasn't quite enough. And maybe I'm jumping to your next question, but I think if Notley decides to leave before the next election, the NDP are in trouble because they don't have another trump card like Rachel Notley.
Yeah, and I was going to actually get into that next, and so we'll let you pick up on that thought in a second. The idea that we've had since 2015 a fairly stable NDP. We've had Rachel Notley as leader. She won the election in 2015 when there were two right of center parties that kind of split votes, managed to run a better campaign than Brian Jean with the Wild Rose. He was a bit of a provincial political neophyte at the time, despite being an MP. And then Jim Prentice, who ran like a bit of an out of touch with Alberta campaign. And then in 2019, the NDP, we all remember, was kind of swept aside by this big blue wave led by Jason Kenney. But Rachel Notley's been a constant in all of that. And she said on Monday night she's going to be sticking around as opposition leader. Like Lorne, as you said, we're not sure who's waiting in the wings for the NDP to take over as leader. But do you see in 4 years Rachel Notley leading the NDP into that election? Or does she stick around for a year maybe to let some other people make an attempt to take the party into the next election?
That's what I would advise her to do, but she's in danger of becoming the Andrea Horwath of Alberta politics. And Horwath was the leader of the New Democrats in Ontario, who lost 4 valiant moralistic battles to try and upset the Conservatives and the Liberals in Ontario. It's a nice, comfortable role to get into. You have the principled ground. You look like you're the moral person. You fight the good fight, but you never win. And without vote splitting on the right, I think this is the best the NDP are ever going to do. In the absence of vote splitting on the right, had there been vote splitting, think about what the results would be now. There would the 2 right-wing parties, had there been 2, would have split. There'd be a 60-seat NDP win this time. So I don't see where she wins. I think, as I said, I think this is their peak. I don't think there is another peak higher than this for them to grow to. I think Smith, as long as she learns to keep her rhetoric tame, as she has for the last few months, she builds as they go to the next election, and the NDP win 28 seats. They win 25 seats. They have some sort of face-saving campaign, but without Notley, they have nothing. And even with Notley, I don't think they win.
Yeah, David, like for you, is it a case of similar to the federal NDP back in the early 2000s, where you had Jack Layton, who came in 2004 and became the face of the party, who was almost more popular than the party itself? Everyone kind of liked Jack Layton. Was the kind of guy you could have a beer with, have a coffee with. Everyone kind of liked him, but maybe didn't like the NDP federally. Is Rachel Notley like that for the Alberta NDP? And if so, how do they move on from her in the event that she decides partway through this term that she's going to step down? Are there people waiting in the wings who are a natural fit, who could do what she's done?
She is a beloved leader of their party, like Layton was, and very charismatic person. So they are going to have a very difficult time moving on from her. There are some other candidates, and I watched every debate during the pandemic, and I didn't like Raki Pancholi's view, pro-lockdown view during the pandemic. Nonetheless, she is a very strong communicator, very presentable. I think obviously bright. Now, is she someone who is willing to make the policy changes? Someone who has a different vision? It's a possibility, and there might be other leaders who have that kind of same ability. So I'm not sure within the existing ranks of the NDP whether they have someone who is going to be able to renew the party. I think in a way that they need to renew it if they're going to beat out Danielle Smith, whose main ability in the end is going to be to read the public and to ascertain what they want and to follow their lead. And that can be a really winning formula for a politician. And the NDP needs to get their own. Need to get their own Danielle Smith, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Now, lastly, I did want to look at one more issue that's come out of this election. And Lorne, you kind of touched on it when you talked about how the NDP was trying to paint Danielle Smith as someone who wasn't fit to represent all Albertans. And this isn't about Danielle Smith's fitness, but it's whether her government is able to represent all Albertans. As many people already know, Edmonton has gone all NDP. Casey Madhu, the lone UCP MLA in Edmonton, lost his seat. They've picked up a couple seats in the surrounding areas. They won a number of seats in Calgary. Nearly half of the seats in Calgary went to the NDP. The NDP looks to pick up Banff Kananaskis, although I know that's one of the the ones that potentially could have a recount. This idea that we have a government who essentially is representing half of Calgary and everywhere else, save for a couple of small ridings, nothing in Edmonton. How does Danielle Smith put this together to reach out to Edmontonians who didn't vote for her party, but also just to represent Edmonton's interest, in government and at the cabinet table?
I don't know if there's one specific way or a variety of policies. They just have to govern as a moderate or modest government and gain back some of the trust of people in, for instance, Sherwood Park Strathcona, which was one of the donut ridings that went to the NDP or appears to have gone to the NDP, and St. Albert, which probably should be a moderate conservative riding, which is now a moderate NDP riding, to get some of those back. But you'll remember after 93, when Klein won his first victory, there were no Edmonton MLAs for the PCs either. And what they did was they appointed cabinet ministers from the suburbs, put them in charge of representing Edmonton ridings. They buddied up nearby MLAs from outside the city with constituencies inside the city, and let the people from those constituencies deal with the suburban and near rural people as if they were their MLAs. I'm not sure that ever works. I've been involved in governments that did that, and I'm not quite sure that ever does much good. What does good is governing sensibly. And in 93, Klein won virtually no support in Edmonton. By 97, the Conservatives won a majority of seats in Edmonton. So in Edmonton, so it's possible to do it. But he won those seats not because he had some clever way of finding representation for people inside Edmonton. He won because we got some trust from Edmontonians. He governed in such a way that Edmontonians were not fearful of him in 97. So I think that's all that Smith can do.
David, for you, do you think it's the kind of the big challenge for Smith in the short term is trying to overcome that representation gap, or is Edmonton not as big an issue as some may be making it out to be today?
It's an interesting question because it's different times in the 90s. In the 90s, the Edmonton-Calgary rivalry was huge. It was people talked about it a lot. I wrote about it a lot. Mm-hmm. It seemed like a real thing. Like these two cities were actually competing with each other, and if one got something, that was bad for the other. And I think we have a much more mature province.
Maybe we're going to get a new arena in Edmonton. No.
Yeah, there you go, Lorne. It's got my backing. I think that people in Alberta realize now that Edmonton, we're in this together. We're all in this together, and Alberta is in a kind of a bigger PR battle mainly over energy issues with the rest of Canada, with the rest of the world, and we're trying to find our place. And we got to band together. So I don't. Smith's challenge now is the divide isn't between the two cities; it's between rural and the cities. So she's got to win Edmonton and Calgary at the same time. And I think if she brings in policies that will win over Calgary, they'll also play well in Edmonton. Like if, let's say, the drug policy really does work, in addition to stronger policing, and the problems that we're seeing, really major problems in our downtown, start to go away. That would be huge for Edmonton voters if they start to see that and they associate that with Danielle Smith. So I think that's the way she wins trust. And we are going to see, if you're, Cyril Turton in Spruce Grove right now, you're probably looking at a cabinet post because, they do need people to represent this part of the world. And we'll see that, but it's going to be at the policy level that Edmontonians, if they're going to be won over.
If you're an MLA from the donut, a UCP MLA from the donut, and you can match your socks up every morning, you're in cabinet.
Yeah. And, we'll see how those cabinet decisions get made over the next few days. We'll see what Premier Danielle Smith's next steps are. Lorne, David, thanks for your time.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you.
That's it for another episode of Under the Dome. Don't forget you can find all past episodes at edmontonjournal.com/underthedome, or you can hit that subscribe button on YouTube. I'm Dave Breakenridge. We'll see you next time.